What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Park Score podcast, the greatest podcast on the entire interwebs. I am back again with Mr. George and Mr. Charlie. You guys recognize them from the other podcasts. Today, we're going to be talking about the right-wing civil war. We're going to be talking about politics. We don't normally cover that on the Park Score podcast, but we're here to give you some deep analysis. And George, Charlie, how have you guys been?
Been great, Parks. I'm glad you just didn't introduce me by my full name. I can remain semi-anonymous here as Mr. Charlie.
I know we might get into some controversial waters, so yeah, but it's good to be back. It's good to be back.
Well, it's perfectly okay if we get controversial. As far as I go, I'm not so much like whatever you guys want to throw at the board. I'm fine with it. But obviously, we all know how to sort of do a little bit of double speak. We know how to dance around the timelines here. But so main thing I want to talk about here, or at least get things kicked off with, is I don't know if you guys saw recently the little spat that happened between Mr. Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, where essentially Ben Shapiro called out Tucker, and Tucker was actually recently nominated as, I think, the number one anti-Semite of the year or something like that, according to some, I don't know, defamation league or something. But there seems to be this sort of rising trend in the right wing. It's been boiling now for I would say at least all of 2025. It seemed to be the main topic of 2025, but there seems to be a split going on between different sides of the right. The one side, which is pro-Israel, and the other side, which is critical or at least somewhat skeptical of Israel. This seems to be, like Charlie was saying earlier in our DM discussion, sort of the elephant in the room. And so I just want to get you guys' take on maybe what has led up to this, what you've noticed about the conflict, what you guys think. Whoever wants to go first.
I'll start, and I'll mention an anecdote. A friend of mine in San Francisco who's big in the health freedom circles, not a traditional right-wing movement. It came about during COVID and brought together, especially in San Francisco, people from a lot of different walks of life, many of them progressive, and you found that in that community, they were being torn apart by the Israel issue because RFK was deemed sort of insufficiently critical of the war in Gaza. So I don't think that this is a uniquely, Israel has become sort of a stumbling block for political movements across the spectrum, and the right wing is no exception. You have a lot of podcasters who are going at it. You've got Nick Fuentes, you've got Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro. That kind of makes up maybe the four major players right now in the conservative media sphere, and Israel is the focal point of their agreements and their disagreements.
George, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, do we know I'm curious what the left-wing situation would be about Israel. Are they all anti-Israel, or do we have any sense of that?
Go ahead, Charlie.
No, I would say there's a lot of division there, and you can kind of look at like the donor class in both parties. There are a lot of very large donors. It's no secret that American Jews around the world are fairly successful. They have money to give, and they also are able to organize and put their money behind groups like AIPAC, which are very successful at lobbying. It's not only the dollars that they spend to promote a certain candidate, it's also the threat of primarying a candidate who doesn't fall in line. And so that's just kind of across the board. It's a well-organized interest, and concentrated interests almost always sort of prevail over the general interest. So maybe it's the more populist left-wing position tends to be skeptical of Israel as a kind of colonial power. But on the whole, I would say that both the Democratic and the Republican Party have been almost monolithically, it's almost the only thing that they have been united in for the last 30 or 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And on the right wing, I know, so I don't have this information. You guys are on the ground there in the U.S., so this is going to come up, but I think we should put it forward, is there's this Christian religious divide on the right wing when it comes to supporting Israel. So my understanding is evangelicals and a certain kind of persuasions of Christians are really into Israel. So just what is it like in terms of numbers from where you guys are living in terms of the split?
George, I don't know if you've encountered firsthand a lot of the sort of evangelical support for Israel. Personally,
No.
I have not seen a whole lot. I do have some friends who are of a more Pentecostal persuasion. And I remember in 2016 and throughout the first Trump administration, they were fervently pro-Trump because, in part, of a guy named Lance Wallnau, who also plays into the whole Candace Owens, Charlie Kirk assassination conspiracy theory, but he's been promoting a theory of sort of Trump as a second Cyrus, who Trump, I think, in his recent administration gave the green light for Israel to move its embassy to Jerusalem, or move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem or something, kind of recognizing the spiritual, Jerusalem as the spiritual capital. And the evangelicals see the fulfillment of some of the prophecies around the construction of the third temple, that has to come about in order for the second coming of Christ to occur. And so they're trying to immanentize the eschaton a little bit, regardless of whether or not maybe Israel is going to be 100% in the right. So I don't know exactly what their perspective is, but Parks, maybe in Texas you've encountered more of that sort of evangelical. Ted Cruz is probably the prototype of the evangelical Christian for Israel, who believes that God blesses those who bless Israel, which, that was one of the points of contention in the famous interview he did with Tucker, where Tucker tried to take that apart.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, that interview between Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson may have, it was at least the start of my, having Tucker on the radar as someone who was maybe hip to the whole Israel. I don't want to say conspiracy, but the whole Israel scandalon that's got the right sort of divided. And I will say, in Texas, George, on a previous podcast, you actually asked me how much of the woke stuff has gotten here into Texas, and I'll be I told you on that pod 2 years ago, and I'll tell you now, the woke stuff really hasn't infiltrated Texas as much. Texas is still pretty much a red state, culturally speaking, at least where I am. I'm not in the cities or anything like that, but one thing that Texas has not been inculcated against is the evangelical, like, hyper Zionism. And so it was maybe less than 2 years ago, I actually was going to like a non-denominational church before I, started looking into Orthodoxy. And I remember there, Israel had popped up in the news or something like that, and we were discussing it in like a young adult Bible study, and we were told in that Bible study, like, well, I think it was something like Israel had like bombed something or somebody or somewhere, and they said, well, I mean, guys, at the end of the day, we have to support Israel. And I remember thinking, I was like, wait a minute, this is kind of strange. And because, you guys know, I had a history, as a right-wing bodybuilder in my youth in college. So I had always been sort of kind of hip to the fact that, hey, maybe this country, they don't necessarily always have America's best interest at heart. They are, after all, they're just a political entity. No political entity is entirely blameless or perfect or anything like that. But I really began to see it, in evangelical circles. And one thing that you will see here in Texas, especially among evangelicals or like non-denom sort of people, is this sort of fervent support for Israel and a conflation of the modern day nation state of Israel with the biblical Israel, which is the people of God. And there is this sort of confused, I guess, theological understanding that those are the same group of, or those are the exact same, people in a certain sense, in the sense that they sort of have some sort of special dispensation and get to play by a different set of rules or something like that. And but no, I would say that it's very rampant here. And sometimes I'll be driving and I'll see like a pickup truck with like an Israel flag or something like that, and it's very strange and disorienting because you don't see this with any other country. But I think it's especially prominent among boomers. Boomers very much are very bought into this narrative. And Ted Cruz, the Tucker Carlson Ted Cruz interview was, I think, what showcased that on a global stage. But Ted Cruz, he said, well, I'm a Bible believing Christian, and I know that the Bible says, you have to bless Israel if you want to be blessed, and if you curse Israel, you'll be cursed. And I think this is a theological assumption that has gone largely unchallenged because everyone in our area of the nation has, pretty much just been taught that from their youth and just kind of accepted it. I think the Zoomers now, at least the more theologically inclined or theologically interested Zoomers now, are starting to question that narrative. And I think it's anytime you have a narrative that has been around for a very long time and there's money invested in making sure that narrative stays alive and operative, there's going to be panic. But that's essentially what I have to say to introduce it.
Right, and I think the generational divide is a big thing because people that grew up with the internet who are curious, you don't have to go down that deep of a rabbit hole. If you're not watching just Fox News and CNN, you're going to start seeing some things. You're going to start noticing. And I'm not talking about crass anti-Semitism, Jewish stereotypes, that kind of thing. I'm talking about this modern state of Israel from its founding to the present has a very well-established track record of political assassinations. E. Michael Jones has written a lot about the use of things like pornography as a kind of psychological weapon against the people. I forget what book, George, maybe you've been up on the E. Michael Jones beat a little bit more, but I think there was a specific campaign early on. It was kind of this like shock and awe thing where they went in and they seized the television stations and just broadcast hardcore pornography for like 24 hours straight on all the TVs. And so and you look into some of the figures and again, through to the present day, the Epstein revelations show Ehud Barak, one of the former prime ministers of Israel, was very tight with Epstein, very tight. So, it's clear to anyone who's paying attention that the modern state of Israel, like most, nation states, they're not squeaky clean. They've got some shenanigans going on with their intelligence agencies, but in particular, Israel seems to really push a lot of these boundaries. And what I wanted to explore is an offshoot of one of George's by now classic articles. If you haven't read it yet, George, what's the name of it? Something like White Magic, Black Magic, and it goes through your sort of Girardian. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit before
Sure.
I introduce my spin on it. But your sort of theory of both, the international cosmopolitan Jew as well as the more Orthodox Jew who settled in Israel after World War II.
Right. So, I wrote this essay, Jews and Anti-Semitism, Black Magic, White Magic. And it was before I interviewed E. Michael Jones twice recently and read his books. So actually recently my mental project has been to kind of reconcile E. Michael Jones' writing and vision of Jews with that essay, which is kind of Girardian. And we can explore that more broadly. I think E. Michael Jones presents kind of classic, in some sense, classic Catholic arguments about the relationship of the Jews in the church. Whereas with my essay, I try to apply Girard's theory of the scapegoat to the Jews. And what I thought would be kind of novel with that theory is that we approach this dynamic of Jews living in Christian countries not through the lens of the Bible, which is how both Jews, and Christians interpret themselves, but to try to look at a possibly subconscious, all right, or unacknowledged dynamic that takes place in the relationship between these two peoples. And that unacknowledged dynamic would be something like, it would be archaic. So essentially, I'm trying to say that there's some programming, some human behavior that's very intrinsic to humanity, tracing back to archaic times. And that even though biblical narrative and Christian narrative and Jewish narrative is used to interpret the events, maybe there's something kind of deeper going on. So what's that deeper thing? I can start with the story that Gerard writes about the Tupinamba tribe in Brazil. Okay, and this is a tribe that was encountered in the Amazon rainforest by the early European explorers. One of the most crazy, scandalous things that they wrote about these people is that they were cannibals, of course, right? So that was probably 1600s or something. Cannibalism became kind of all the rage in Paris and the European capitals. Everybody was really curious about it and how does it work. So explorers would go and try to figure out how does it all work. But this story has more, it's not just cannibalism, and kind of teaches you that cannibalism is not like kind of food, or it's not a nutritional plan, right? It's a very ritual and religious thing. So the story is very simple. There's these Tupinamba natives. What they would do is they would have a battle with enemy soldiers, and some of them they would just kill, and they might even cannibalize on the spot, according to these early explorers. But they had this thing where they would capture enemy soldiers, bring them back into their village, to their tribe, and then for a year or two, they would treat them like kings. They would allow them to break all the rules, eat everybody's food, transgress all the boundaries. So apparently they would even entice nudge the captive to sleep with people's women. Until one day, suddenly, maybe 1 or 2 years later, the man would be tied, slapped around, insulted, and eventually ceremonially murdered and eaten ceremonially. And then Gerard finds another parallel story with the Ainu tribes in Japan, northern Japan. These would be kind of Japanese indigenes who did the parallel thing with bear cubs. It was a famous thing. So they would capture a baby bear cub, raise it for 1 or 2 years with utmost care, treating it as a human baby. And then after that period, maybe 6 months, whatever, the bear cub would be tied. It would be ritually killed by everybody. Like all the males would shoot arrows into it. And then its blood would be drunk. It would be very ceremoniously devoured. So what does this story have to do with Israel, right? This story points to this very ancient idea of scapegoating mechanism, and the idea that human societies like to transfer some sort of their collective guilt onto an outsider. But the idea goes something like this. You can't just blame somebody who's far away from your village and all the problems going on in your village, right? Because clearly that person has nothing to do with your village. So you need to bring the culprit in, let them kind of wreak havoc, cause trouble, and then all the anger and all the kind of whatever violence is transferred onto this culprit, who's then cathartically killed. So when I look at then I'm extending this, but then let's skip ahead to medieval times, right? In medieval times, you have Jews, they're usurers, they're financiers, they live in medieval Europe. And again, if you look at the literature of that era, everything is interpreted through the biblical lens and the biblical narrative. But if you try to look at it from this kind of archaic narrative, it kind of looks like somewhat similar to Tupinamba people. You have these people who are invited to do all the dirty work. Christians are not allowed to lend money at interest. Christians are not allowed to engage fight. It's a dirty job, but at the same time, it's like a privileged job. So there's that ambivalence, right? You are getting an outsider to do the dirty work. But it's also this outsider's kind of getting rich off of it, so it's attracting violence towards them. And also he's doing work that you might secretly want to do. I mean, it's taboo for Christians to lend money and interest, but you got all these princes and knights and so on, and people who need those loans, who want those loans because they want to, do some business venture or something like that. And then from the Jewish perspective, going back to what you said, Charlie, about the kind of liberal Jew versus Orthodox Jew, as a kind of far-fetched hypothesis, I was saying that these isolated Orthodox communities or Hasidim, they kind of don't want to play that game. They don't want to engage. They don't want to play the scapegoat, right? They kind of want to be left alone to a maybe certain degree, to a greater degree that liberal Jews. Whereas when you look at these liberal Jews, or what E. Michael Jones called the revolutionary Jew, who've been participating in revolutions since revolution started in modern times, it seems that they embrace this archaic scapegoat role, right? They are willing to be that guy who's that person, that group that's going to push the boundaries, that's going to cause trouble. And like I was saying to you, Charlie, if you just think of a Christian, I don't know, somewhere in the 1600s, there's this push to modernity, to modernize the world, right? To move away from feudal warfare to commerce, to maybe capitalist ordering and so on, to urban lifestyle. A Christian revolutionary might be conflicted a little bit, right? Because they might feel like they're betraying tradition, or they might feel like this might not be entirely good. Whereas a Jewish revolutionary has nothing to lose by abandoning tradition, because it's the Christian tradition, and they're at odds naturally at all with Christianity. So this makes these Jews, revolutionary Jews, right? They have nothing to lose in pushing the boundaries and stirring stuff up, because it's not their tradition anyways. They feel like they are kind of violent. They might even feel like they're violently, or well, not violently, but like they're nudged into being the bad guy. And they just embrace it. And I think you see this with communist revolution. You see that with whatever E. Michael Jones argues, that a lot of Jews were involved in Protestant revolutions, certainly in the commercial revolution, Rothschilds and so on, and Freemasonry. So, and then going back to modern times, it seems like the Zionist Jews would be the inheritors of that ancient now role of Jews as ancient scapegoats who relish and try to capitalize on their role of stirring stuff up, right? And there might be some symbiosis there with non-Jewish American establishment who has their own motives to stir trouble in Middle East or try to profit from Middle East, and then Israel is happy to do their bidding. So that's my arc of Girard to Israel.
Yeah, Charlie, you wanna bounce something off of that?
Yeah, I guess in my recollection, maybe there was some distinction in that article between the more sort of the white magic Jews, who are more of just the successful professionals in the diaspora, compared with the Zionists, who are in some sense sort of trying to opt out of the game altogether. And I'm very loosely paraphrasing, but does that ring any kind of bell, George?
Yeah. All right, so I guess that would be the difference between what I said and E. Michael Jones. So E. Michael Jones' Zionist Jews are the revolutionary Jews.
Right.
In my essay, I thought of Israel, and I'm sure there's both types of people in Israel, right? A lot of Jews in Israel are not necessarily apocalyptic revolutionaries, but they love and want Israel. And these are, I guess they tend to be secular Jews. These are the Jews who just want to kind of exit that game of being a scapegoat of the nations, have their own little nations, and just to be a normal country. I think that's the exact wording I used.
Well, what I think is funny is you have, and again, actually the same friend who was talking about the split in the health freedom circles in San Francisco was also talking about how you have, he had been at a Charlie Kirk event in Berkeley some months or maybe over a year before the assassination, but he was kind of describing that there were these, Soros-aligned groups that were protesting, and he described them as kind of trans-Tifa. And George Soros funds a lot of these sort of color revolutions in different countries. That's one kind of revolution on one side of the political spectrum, on the left. But then you also have in the Middle East a different kind of revolution happening in different places where, I think it's been Israel, the conservative arm is kind of trying to stoke all these different revolutions in Middle Eastern countries just to prevent any sort of coherent governance from emerging around them in the Middle East. Like you look at Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and these are economic forces to be reckoned with. They're sort of emerging almost as a new financial center that is competing with London and New York for the ultimate seat of global power in a way. And so that's where my theory, my kind of offshoot of your article, George, is this idea that the somewhat, maybe you could say, right-wing Zionists, that they are, again, kind of taking on that role of the scapegoat, or like they're going to do illegal things. They're going to do extrajudicial assassinations. They're going to, broadcast pornography onto the television sets of the people they're trying to subdue, and the whole litany of things. Epstein, using sexual blackmail as or using blackmail material as a lever of power, which they can influence foreign governments. All these things, but in some sense, it's also London and New York that stand to gain from Israel being such a regional force that's at least kind of broadly aligned still with those interests. So that's my conspiracy theory. That's where I'm coming from.
No, it makes sense, and I guess we should bring up that point that in this archaic default mindset, that scapegoat has to have some kind of fascinating magnetism to them. I write that throughout centuries, Jews were kind of a perfect candidate for the magical stranger because they kind of fit in, right? They're kind of white, right? I know it's a big debate, but they fit into the European cultures, European-derived cultures. But being the people of the book, having written the Bible, charges them with this very magical force, right? And what Girard would argue, and what he sees in all these primitive or primeval human societies, which relate to our primitive psyche, is that magical charge can easily flip from positive to negative, right? And I think that relates directly to like Texas, right? I would say that maybe these Texan evangelicals, they in a sense almost fetishize the Jews. They imbue them with this white, in their case, white magic, because they're going to bring about the second coming of Christ. But that white magic can really easily flip into black magic. And that's exactly the flip you see to Penumbra, right? Suddenly this fascinating foreigner who's worshipped and thought it was amazing. It takes one little thing to flip into, for this fascination of love to flip into fascination of hate. And I think that going back to Charlie's point about how these Jewish players, revolutionaries, have the chutzpah, right, to do this crazy stuff, I think they're kind of masterful at exploiting this Jewish aura, at a really high level and getting away with it. And if you have certain type of Christians that I would call naive, as far as the machinations go of how the geopolitics work, then it's very easy for the Jews to work their Jewish magic on these people and get people like Tom Cruise and such to buy the magic of the white magic, Jew magic. But it's always a dangerous game, because I wouldn't be surprised if suddenly these evangelicals who are absolutely worshiping Israel, it takes like one bad news and then suddenly they go from loving Israel to wanting to, wipe out Israel. I think that's how it works. I think the kind of people who hate Jews and love Jews, the one thing they have in common is they have the magic Jew kind of fetish, just on the other, on the other flip side of it. I think the opposite of that is just trying to kind of be sober about it and, try to do, I guess, what we're doing, which is just be rational about it and kind of see what the real, what's really going on here.
For sure. And George, I wanted to ask, so, just now you're talking about how quickly things can flip from positive to negative, especially in a situation that's sort of magically charged. And I think speaking of it in terms of, the magical or mystical dimension, I think it's a good observation. So we were talking about how quickly the public perception can just flip on a dime. And I did want to ask you guys honestly about the Charlie Kirk event, because we know that was obviously the biggest, event probably that happened this year. There was a very early speculation right after the event that, Charlie was beginning to kind of shift his view of Israel. Whenever I first was introduced to Charlie Kirk, I was actually a college student, and I actually saw this video from Nick Fuentes sending a bunch of groypers into Charlie Kirk's event, and they were pretty much harassing him with questions about Israel because Charlie was a staunch supporter of Israel. Nick Fuentes had his political career, essentially had an attempted assassination of his political career in the crib by Shapiro et al. Because of his questions that he had about Israel, and Charlie Kirk was very against Nick, got him kicked out of events and stuff like that, and then so that was my only knowledge of Charlie Kirk to begin with. And then years later, the Charlie Kirk event happens. Everyone starts to take a little bit more interest in Charlie, after the event, and there was this theory that Charlie was beginning to there was beginning to be some cracks in his staunch support for Israel. He was beginning to maybe ask questions himself. But now, even that post-Charlie event narrative has sort of changed. We've gone from Candace saying, I think Charlie might have had questions about Israel. He was beginning to change his tone on Israel to, his wife is now on a tour telling people, and I'm not joking about this, his wife said, Charlie would come into the house and he would throw his keys, onto the cabinet and say shalom or something like that. He would, so it's gone from Charlie was changing his tune to no, actually Charlie was like on the brink of converting to Judaism or something. And obviously there's a lot of confusion around that event, but I can't seem to make sense of it, honestly. And I was just wondering if you guys had any sort of a take on it, or, because here's my brief theory. I think there's maybe some I would give some credence to the view that Charlie was beginning to maybe have some questions, and there was speculation early on that his assassination was in some way, shape, or form tied to those doubts that he was having, and seeing the impact of this event, it's clear that Charlie Kirk was, well loved by a ton of people. He was definitely more on the normie side. Like, I had sort of written him off because I was like, he's a normie, he's whatever. And then after this event, I take a second look at him, but he clearly had a very big audience. His audience was more, say, closer to that evangelical Zionist side of the right, and which makes up a large majority, you could say, of the right. And I just wonder if maybe that day would have went differently if maybe we would be in some sort of alternate timeline right now. Anyways, I've been rambling. You guys, I don't know what your take is on that, but
yeah, it's my first thought, like the same day or maybe the day after, but my mind did go to the usual suspects of assassination plots. But in the weeks that followed, and just to be clear, that my mind did go to Israel. I thought I had known about some of this stuff going on, or actually, I think maybe some commentators were starting to shine a light on the fact, and now it's come to light. I mean, there was the Megyn Kelly interview where he was saying that basically, he felt like he was being totally strong-armed. He couldn't say anything disagreeing with Israel. He said that his moral character was being put into question, not his decisions. But no, he was a bad person if he, said anything critical of Israel. And even the letter that Netanyahu quickly came out and, selectively quoted from, saying, something to the effect that made it sound like Charlie Kirk was still fervently pro-Israel. The rest of that letter was basically telling Netanyahu, here's why you guys need to step up, because I can't carry water for you anymore. You need to step up your social media game. Here's how you can do it. So, it's clear that he wasn't making such a 180 that he, I think he probably still had a lot of sympathy for Israelis, in the same way that a lot of American conservatives and even a lot of just normal Americans do when they look at sort of, I think when you look at kind of the Palestinian society versus the Israeli society in a lot of ways shares a more common moral heritage with Christian society than the Muslim society. And if you actually drill down into some of those things, we probably would find a lot of the sort of Palestinian society to be pretty abhorrent. And so we kind of knee-jerk want to side with Israel. And I think Charlie Kirk was like that. He thought that Israel had the moral high ground up until they didn't. And when did they stop having the moral high ground? Sometime between, the October 7th terrorist attacks, which may or may not have been one of those kind of let it happen sort of things to give pretext for a much larger escalation. And what I think, most decent people can agree has been a sort of unjustifiable response in the bombings and in the killings of innocent people in Gaza. So all this is to say, there is a plausible motive, given that Charlie Kirk was withdrawing his support for Israel, to say, okay, Israel's like, this guy is no longer useful to us. Maybe beyond that, he's going to become much more of a liability going forward. It's conceivable. But is it I think this is where people like Nick Fuentes actually have heightened their own credibility greatly, is that they didn't go straight for the low-hanging fruit conspiracy theory. They actually kind of held their tongue a little bit and said, wait a minute, where is the actual evidence? Sure, some things don't add up about Tyler Robinson maybe being on the roof with a Mauser or whatever the caliber of rifle that would have presumably shot a gaping hole in Charlie Kirk's neck. And we had a little bit of chat on this earlier on X. Like, we're not firearm experts. Like, it's plausible that there could be some way. I'm inclined to take the Tyler Robinson shooter on the roof narrative. I won't say at face value, but I will say that it's the null hypothesis, and you have to bring some really strong evidence. So what does Candace Owens actually end up bringing? She says, she day in and day out is playing up this detective story where she is the protagonist. She is, Tintin or who I don't know who is Scooby-Doo or she's gonna pull off the mask at the end of the day, but then with each show she's not actually getting us anywhere. She's going on these tangents and she's weaving things together in ways that don't really make sense. Erica Kirk, I have no idea. She kind of rubs me the wrong way. She strikes me as sort of a politician, probably less sincere than her husband was, but probably, more sincere than Jeffrey Epstein or something. She's somewhere in that very vast continuum. But that's my take. And I think that the really unfortunate thing is I think a lot of people, including myself, never really appreciated Charlie Kirk when he was alive. And we've kind of come to realize that in some sense he was holding together the center. He was in Trump's ear telling him not to bomb Iran. He was maybe in some ways sort of moderating or restraining Israel's hand because they knew that if they couldn't convince Charlie Kirk, it was like Walter Cronkite during the Vietnam War. Once you've lost Charlie, you've kind of lost the war. And so in that sense, again, you've kind of got you've got a strong motive. Maybe Israel had a hand in it, maybe they didn't. But I think that the people promoting that need to come up with a more coherent narrative for how it was done. You could say the same thing about 9/11 conspiracy theories or JFK conspiracy theories. it's very hard to find a smoking gun when there's so much sort of fog of war and possibly even misinformation and diversions.
Yeah, well, this lone gunman shooting is starting to be a recurring theme. That started with the assassination of JFK, right? E. Michael Jones brings up this topic, and I wonder if one day we're going to uncover the MO of some of these agencies, where they basically have a cache, a stable of unstable, no pun intended, but a stable of unstable individuals who can be easily manipulated into assassinating someone. And then the way that these agencies would act in a conspiratorial manner is they would just unleash them and clear the path for them to do their act.
Or set them up as a patsy.
Yeah.
Put them somewhere where they think that they're doing one thing, but actually, they think that they're aiding and abetting some other, who knows? I think that's a great point, though.
Yeah. Because it just doesn't make sense that all these history-changing shootings or assassinations were done by lone deranged gunmen. It's always the same story, and the media follows the same thing, hushes it up. There's a whole bunch of red flags. Move on to the next news cycle. Wasn't there a Vegas shooting that never got resolved? Again, JFK. I mean, it's just at this point, it's just too suspicious, I think.
But can we talk about the Candace as useful idiot theory as well?
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So this is one of my another borrowed theory. This one, the seed was planted by Ron Unz, who runs the Unz Review on unz.com. And he just rounds up a whole bunch of heterodox voices from the internet. But he also writes prolifically himself. He publishes like a 12,000 word essay twice a week, it seems. And a couple years ago, he put out, this was during the sort of, when Candace's main beat was the Brigitte Macron is actually a transgender man, which sounds crazy, and then you look into it, and it sort of still sounds crazy after you look into it. And part of she also, I think, maybe has promoted the Michelle Obama is a man, and like all these things, they're just not that plausible to someone who hasn't gone deep into the weeds. And Unz's theory for why Candace's YouTube channel was not racking up strikes. Nick Fuentes has been banned on YouTube forever, but Candace Owens is given carte blanche. Like, she gets thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars per episode just based on the number of views she's generating for YouTube. Why does the establishment, or why does the sort of tech Google establishment allow this to happen? Well, maybe it's because he thought she makes conservatives look crazy, and she'll muddy the waters in just the way that the perpetrators would want, in the sense that, she puts out all this stuff about even linking it back to Macron, linking the Charlie Kirk assassination back to Macron, and saying, it was because Charlie Kirk was going to have me back at Turning Point USA. So again, making herself sort of the star of the show. So maybe in some sense she's her own worst enemy, just because she craves the spotlight so much. But I should also hedge this by saying it's possible that what she's talking about is, that there's a grain, or more than a grain, of truth to it. I just don't have the time to wade through it. And when I have tried, I actually have made an effort. I think I shared with you guys my Notebook LM. This is the Google. Funnily enough, Google has a tool that allows you to compile a whole bunch of source material and kind of tease out narratives from a large body. So I scraped all of Candace Owens' 40 episodes on Charlie Kirk, took the transcripts to see if I could make a coherent story out of it. And it starts off totally, coherent, the whole thing about the motive that Israel might have had. But then it starts to get into Operation Mocking Plane and the theory that revolves around, I'm reading from Notebook LM here, too. Do you guys mind if I read for a minute?
Yeah.
All right. I could even share my screen if but I don't want to script your editing flow.
No, go for it.
All right. So let me pull this up here, and I'll just share the one window. So here's all the sources here. You can click in and you'll see this is the transcript. So it's just a mass of material that I would never have time to watch or read. But you can ask it questions. So I was actually, earlier in the conversation, I was asking about Lance Wallnau and how he plays into her theory. And apparently she says that he might have been operational driver behind Turning Point USA Faith. Sources within the organization allege he was privately directing large sums of money into TPUSA Faith and essentially running the show behind the scenes. So I could ask kind of a follow-up question here and say, like, so was Lance Wallnau also affiliated with Israel, or what is his connection to Israel in this view? And it's going to think for a minute. It's got a lot of files, so we'll give it a second there. But here on Operation Mocking Plane, you can see there's this whole theory about a Falcon 7X with tail number SUBTT. Owens presents flight data suggesting these planes were tracking Kirk, appearing in cities near his scheduled events. I feel like this one has been debunked. I feel like she's kind of backed away from it. But then there's other stuff like a little further down. Let's see, where's the... Okay, here we go. I actually had Notebook LM sort them by what's most credible to what's least credible. So here's something where she was talking about she had a premonition, she had a dream of imminent danger related to bees, which she connected to Utah's beehive state flag. So anyway, I mean, I think that these are, I almost wonder if maybe it's time to revisit the Kennedy files and all that and just put them all into Notebook LM. And maybe we can finally, with the advances in AI, come up with an airtight narrative. We'll finally get them, guys.
You know, what's super ironic about all of this, actually, is I remember when the event first happened, and in my mind, Candace still had a level of credibility because she's citing all these this personal relationship with Charlie and all of these different speculations she had, and they were still within the realm of possibility, and they confirmed my suspicions. So I was lending a lot of credibility to her. She actually, in one of her, I think it was the first podcast she did responding to the event, she talked about this book called Chaos. And I think the book, if I remember correctly, covers the Manson murders and this specific, let's say, strategy employed by intelligence agencies wherein they, in order to control the flow of information, don't try to prevent the truth getting out. What they do is they just flood every single channel with all this different contradictory information. So you have so much information to parse through that the average person just sort of gives up and says, you know what, I can't make sense of this. I'm gonna go with the official narrative. I just find it ironic that she started out, she mentioned this at the very beginning, and then it seems that she herself has either fallen prey to it, or I don't know really what's going on with her necessarily. But as for my own case, like with the Charlie event, I've just gotten to a point where I'm like, there's so much contradictory information, and also the official story makes no sense. So I've landed in a place where I'm like, I officially do not believe the official story, but I just refuse to try to parse through any of this stuff, or try to, come to any conclusion about it. But, so go ahead, George.
So they're winning. They got you. They got you exactly where they want you to.
I mean,
but I'm there too. I'm not. Yeah. We're all there, right? So it kind of works. I would say even I agree with it. I'm with you guys. And with the whole thing, as a Candace is the useful idiot. With me, I think there's one thing I try to write about early on is this idea that there's two types of conspiracy theories, almost like a spectrum of conspiracy theories, and it's a confusing spectrum that works to accomplish this kind of stuff. People say conspiracy theory nut. That person's a conspiracy theory nut. And they might say to you, if you're asking, they say that to people who are asking a legitimate question. But on the other hand, we have to admit that there is such thing as being a conspiracy nut. Like, you can literally go nuts. Conspiracy theories. On the extreme end of that spectrum, I would just put the schizophrenics, right? the guy who lives behind a dumpster fled home because the government eye is watching him from the clouds. And that kind of person will have a whole other constellation of conspiracy theories. That person's nuts. That's bad. He's not right. He should get home and get medications, right? And on the other end of that spectrum is asking legitimate, rational questions about political machinations, which is how the world works, right? Politics is always about conspiracy. So I think the language itself is confusing because we're using the same word for those two very different things, right? If you're a schizophrenically minded person, they call you a conspiracy theorist. But if you're asking legitimate questions, they also call you a conspiracy theorist. So they're dumping you in that same bucket in order to cause confusion. And I think that speaks at a less extreme level to the point you, Charlie, were making about Candace Owens, right? You have legitimate conspiracy questions, right? And a classic way to fight them or to confuse them is to throw in somebody who might be nuts, right? And now it's difficult to tell the difference between somebody who's schizophrenic-like and somebody who's asking legitimate questions. So I think we should have a different name for these two things. And I mean, I don't know how, and then the question becomes, where do you draw the line? But this spectrum, this difficulty in drawing the line is what plays to the advantage of the powerful people. And moreover, just to add a Girardian point, Girard would argue that this kind of conspiracy theory, he relates that to the archaic religion, right? The scapegoating mechanism. So like in Girardian anthropology, your archaic tribe who gets into trouble and then blames all the trouble on a random arbitrary victim and lynches them, gets rid of them, that's your kind of original conspiracy theory. So Girard would almost say that the archaic religion was all about conspiracy theories, like myths themselves are conspiracy theories. So there's this mental illness type of conspiracy theories. There's also this kind of paganism to conspiracy theories. I think if you go to some of the ignorant places of the world even today, you're going to find that the villagers there are very, very prone to a certain type of conspiracy theory, ascribing magical negative influence, malevolence to the Jew, to the white man, or something like that, right? All these things are bad and ignorant, right? But then you got that on one side, and on the other side you got legitimate questions, and that I think really is the kind of key thing. Can we distinguish between the two, and how do we do that?
And real quick, I just wanted to drop this in here. So I've actually, I think, heard you were talking about conspiracy theory, how it's a spectrum, but how essentially you have what are legitimate sort of credible suspicions and then full-blown schizophrenia. But essentially all of them get lumped into this conspiracy like umbrella. It's one big umbrella. And it is a very effective tool for essentially, like if you label someone a conspiracy theorist, then they are sort of written off in the eyes of the general public as someone not trustworthy or somebody who's, potentially insane. And I was just now looking it up. I believe I heard Jay Dyer speaking about the origin of that term conspiracy theory as specifically as a tool of social engineering, because the idea is, so it was coined much earlier than Karl Popper, but Karl Popper actually wrote in, I believe it was his book called The Open Society and Its Enemies, about quote unquote conspiracies or conspiracy theories, and how conspiracy theories are essentially these large scale surmises of plots that may or may not be happening, that are enacted by powerful people to control society, which we all know that's not something that ever happens. And so Karl Popper was critical of quote unquote conspiracy theories and conspiracists, because he said that these were not useful speculations, or that essentially these were I think he essentially said that they weren't conducive to an open and a free society, these speculations. And so yeah, it is absolutely very useful for, you could say, whoever is responsible for the Charlie event to kind of have this easy designator, being able to call anyone who speculates on the event in a specific way a conspiracy theorist, because you have someone like Candace who is legitimately tying together all these things that are not necessarily connected, talking about dreams that she had and stuff like that, and saying like, I have a hunch or whatever. It's very useful to have someone like Candace to say, oh, see, you're a conspiracy theorist because you think, I don't know, our greatest ally in the Middle East did it, and Candace is also a conspiracy theorist. Ergo, you guys are both not credible in your speculations. But anyways.
Yeah, and you can also just be narcissistic and not crazy. So, let's say you pick up on a few grains of truth, but then you're connecting it to yourself in these far-fetched ways. Like, I don't think that she's certifiably crazy or insane or anything like that. I think that she's laughing I shouldn't say she's laughing all the way to the bank, because I think that the potential for self-deception is also huge, and that applies to all of us. So, I hold a number of conspiracy theories near and dear, but I try not to integrate them with my identity in a way where my status grows if I can, find more evidence for the theory. That's maybe part of the reason that I don't go so much like on the record with these things, or when I do, if I hedge a lot, because it's just a bad idea to wind up your identity. I think that's what you're getting at, George, with the people in these archaic societies. It was their belief, almost in the same way that something like the creed is our belief. Like, you had to believe in this ritual in order for it to be effective. You had to believe in the guilt of the victim in order for it to be effective. And so I think that the risk is that, Christians, or, I'll just say Christians, I think there is a real risk that we start to substitute a conspiratorial view of Israel as a substitute for authentic faith, and completely miss the point in doing so. And the point, I think, that we've gotten a little bit closer to in this conversation is, one, a sort of complicity. Is that a word? Complicitness between, we'll say, the powers and principalities and this one particular nation state that happens to be very well positioned to do a lot of the covert ops around the world. But we're all a part of the power, man. We're all a part of the power.
Right. So, yeah.
Sweet.
What else?
Yeah.
How about that Ray Pete?
So
he's got some good conspiracy theories.
Ray Pete. Oh, yeah. I want to do an episode eventually on the metaphysics of Ray Pete, but that's something I think I would definitely have to do some research on. Because, Ray Pete, he was a big proponent of, not necessarily trusting the institutional narrative around things like diet, around things like health and stuff like that.
Pharmaceutical industry,
and again,
scientific establishment.
Right. And even with Pete, what the double-edged sword, you could say, of conspiratorial thinking, or the double-edged sword of thinking for yourself, is that sometimes you can, as Charlie was saying earlier, fall into self-deception. And it's not always easy to tell when you are or are not falling into self-deception, because you're deceiving yourself. And, in Pete's case, he was so skeptical of any institutional narrative that his metaphysics essentially gets into a sort of, it's almost sort of a Gnostic metaphysics, or we've said in previous episodes, sort of a monistic metaphysics. But all that to say, that is something that, I hope anyone watching this podcast here today, I'm not trying to draw any conclusions with Charlie's, event or anything like that, because the truth is, like I was saying earlier, I have no idea what actually happened. I know that a lot of things have changed since the event. I know that the rift in the right since the event, as George was saying, the thing kind of tying everyone to, what was it, George that said that, or Charlie that said that? The Charlie was sort of the middleman between all these different like forces that are kind of weighing in, and with him gone, now you see this sort of civil war happening in the right. I do want to close it out by saying, I mean, I don't know if you guys have any closing thoughts, but I do want to say, we started this episode talking about Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson kind of going at it recently. They both had speeches where they pretty much Ben Shapiro blasted Tucker, and then Tucker seemed just more so defensive and almost apologetic. But he stood by his guns. He essentially said, "Hey, I have legitimate criticisms of this country. Why are we completely subservient to them and completely unable to ask any questions about them or anything like that?" And he reaffirmed that he's not an anti-Semite or anything like that. But whenever I was maybe 14 years old, I remember the first ever time I got red pilled was on a Ben Shapiro. It was Ben Shapiro owns the libs compilation or something like that. And it's just so funny. You see those memes where it's the kid that's oh yeah, I'm the bright-eyed, starry-eyed kid that's oh yeah, I'm gonna own the libs or something like that. And then you cut to, you do the time skip arc, and then they're there's thunder in the background, and they're oh yeah, Ben Shapiro, he's the bad guy. Now I realize Ben Shapiro's the bad guy. But anyways, I think Ben Shapiro's political capital is massively falling off. I think his time is pretty much over, and he's just desperately kind of grasping for any clout that he has left. And I think the right is moving in a pretty definitive direction, and you're seeing the last gasps.
I would add about the narcissistic part Charlie mentioned. I think we should have mentioned at some point that with the Zionists or the Jews, they do have that victim mentality, and I think in their heads. So just to be clear, I don't think a lot of these people are just, the meme, just deliberately trying to destroy the world, but they have convinced themselves that they are the world's preeminent victims. And that therefore, whatever they do is justified, right? So that definitely plays to that not necessarily manipulative, but narcissistic, self-deluded part of creating conspiracies that you justify in your own head, not necessarily because you're a cartoonishly evil person, but because you just think the ends justify the means. And I think a lot of Zionists are definitely driven by that spirit. Of first being conditioned as young children, especially the boomer Zoomers, right? The boomer Zionists. The Holocaust was horrible, and therefore whatever we do to get our dues is justified. And I think that goes a really far way in explaining a lot of the conspiratorial stuff Israel might have done, and Israel supporters might have done, and still keep doing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the note that I would end on is just the last thing I have to say, at least, is this is one of these problems for. I'll focus on the right because that's kind of my concern and my domain. We might find that the 2026 midterms and then into the 2028 election issue will still be defined by this issue. And maybe, the right will lose a lot of power. Maybe we'll lose the White House because J.D. Vance can't unite, the Nick Fuentes faction with the Ben Shapiro faction the way that Trump at least nominally could, even though I guess he lost Nick Fuentes at the end there. At that point, Nick didn't have any real influence over the outcome of the election. In this cycle, he actually might. And there are a lot more people now who I think for them, young people, this is their single issue, or they'll die on this hill, or they're not going to show up for a candidate who doesn't have a clear and articulate stance. I've actually been really impressed by J.D. Vance, at how he's walked this line. I think, he understands the concerns, but he's also a bit of a realist, and he's not going to try to, necessarily solve this issue from the position of the vice presidency, nor could any president solve this issue. It's a stumbling block, and the fact that you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque literally on the rock of the it's like I forget if it's the rock where Isaac was said to have been, put up for sacrifice by Abraham, or is that the lore?
Muhammad ascended to heaven from
well,
that
rock. Too. I mean, you've got in Jerusalem, but it's like literally a stumbling block, and the only solution is Christ. The only solution to the conflict in the Middle East is through Christ, and I think that's kind of how God set up this whole drama of human salvation, is that there actually may be a conflagration, and it might get violent, and it already has, and it's going to maybe get more violent. But we don't need to stand on the sidelines entirely. We just can't think that we're going to solve the problem, and it's almost like the harder we try to solve it, the more we, I don't know that we necessarily need more dialogue. I think we just need to deepen our own faith. And as always, the Rene Girard answer of what should I do in the face of all this screwiness in the world? The answer is just personal holiness and repentance.
Yeah, I honestly cannot imagine ending it on a better note than that. George, Charlie, I think this was a good episode. Thank you guys for coming on, and thank you for the astute analysis of the current right-wing civil war. Anyways, guys, this has been the Park Score Podcast. Thank you for watching.